Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, and this is a little Victober ramble, I suppose. Petra's challenge for this Victober 2023 is to read a Victorian first-person narrative, and thinking about that challenge got me thinking about how Victorian authors use the first person, particularly in novels and stories, the fictional first person narrative. And I'm going to give you five ways that I think Victorian authors use first person narratives, and invite your opinions too. So, I'm going to relate that to the two books I've already read this Victober. They're in the first person, and one that I'm planning to read, and other Victorian books, a few other Victorian books that I've read. So, example number one of a use of first person narration is to the kind of classic one of creating the impression of a memoir, like a kind of a fake memoir, often sort of Bildungsroman style, of a character's journey, childhood through to adulthood, how they change, how they develop through their own report, as it were, and the essence of those is that the narrator is looking back at the events of their youth, with the sort of benefit of hindsight. And the classic example of that is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. And David is. You're conscious throughout that he's there, the adult David Copperfield, retelling his own experiences. And he's careful to avoid spoilers in telling his own tale, but you do know that he's kind of reflecting on his experiences, and amongst all the awful things that happened to him in his childhood and youth, he survives because you know that it's him telling the story, and that gives a particular flavour to the book. Now, I read for this Victober Jill by Amy Dillwyn, and that's a sort of less well-known example of the same sort of thing. It's got the first person narrator's got the same purpose there, because she says, Jill, the character, that she's reviewing her past adventures, her past career, as it were, and promises to give an honest representation of herself, of her character traits, and she's kind of showing us how she changed as a result of those experiences and the people that she spent time with, and how perhaps she went from being more selfish to a bit more moral and more thoughtful, but also, and this is the clever thing, I suppose, about the way Dillwyn writes this, is that Jill is quite a shocking character in Victorian terms, quite bold, quite adventurous, does some things that feel quite, might have seemed quite immoral to a reader, and certainly feel quite risky even to a kind of present day reader. And that first person kind of looking back approach, where we start the book with her sort of saying, "This is me now, looking back at what I did," means it slightly reduces the sort of outrage that a Victorian reader might have felt. Somehow it sort of modifies, because you feel like, oh well, these are experiences that she's going to learn from, so that makes it more acceptable at Victorian times. And also, in her more sort of extreme and reckless adventures, again, we know she's going to survive because she's there to tell the tale later. So, we get regular sort of reminders that we've got an older narrator looking back. Example number two of how Victorian authors use first-person narrative for me is kind of a variant on the fictional memoir, because it's books like Jane Eyre, for example, or Aurora, which is one I finished this Victober, which is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's narrative poem that's in the first person. And there, the use of the first person is not, although both of them are in a sense that journey, that sort of childhood to adulthood journey. But, and this is a key difference, it's much more about allowing us to share the narrator's innermost thoughts and feelings. There's a sort of an immediacy about the way that they're written. They write it as if they are in the moment, and we get to experience that moment with them, which is so powerfully used in both those books and in others. And they don't write it kind of showing the benefit of hindsight, really, and that gives us as readers a chance sometimes to see things that they don't. For example, in Aurora Leigh, we can speculate perhaps if is Aurora, perhaps more in love with Romney than she imagines. And in Jane Eyre, we can kind of question on her behalf what's going on, whilst experiencing it very dramatically as she does. Now, number three is first person narrative used for even more dramatic effect. And that, I think, you see in kind of like ghost and horror stories of the Victorian era. Stories like M.R. James, he often wrote in with a first-person narrator. Sheridan and Fanu's Carmilla, the original kind of the sort of Victorian vampire novel. And in Dracula we see it too. It's that, again, the first person narrative gives it an immediacy that makes it more scary, more dramatic, more exciting. But also, and this is the twist, it allows a kind of a claim for the veracity of what's being told. It's like, you'd never believe this story if I wasn't here as an eyewitness to tell you how it happened. And that's the sort of the fiction that makes the stories work. Another way, my number 4, that Victorian authors use first-person narrative really effectively, I think, is for humour. And I'm thinking here of Three Men in a Boat by Jerome, or Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Using the first-person narrative allows us to see the characters' delusions or foolishness or their sort of the antics they get up to through their description, and they can give quite a sort of a deadpan description of what happens. And in Jerome's case in Three Men in a Boat, it sort of allows the narrator to be kind of quite self-deprecating, maybe, but also delightfully daft. Or with Mr. Petra in Diary of a Nobody, he's quite delusional, and we see that. But either way, that sort of first-person description gives us the license to laugh, and it's much funnier than if it weren't in the first person, I think. More effective as a humorous style of writing. Then my number 5 is a slightly, quite different one in a way. And that's when I think the first person narrator kind of stands in for the reader in a sense, observes and reports for us as the reader. And the best example I can think of for that is the way Conan Doyle uses Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories, because, Watson gets to be the ordinary person like us who can show us Holmes's eccentricities, but also his brilliance, is the person that things can be explained to, and then we get that explanation. And like, if Holmes were the narrator, because he's the central character, if he were the narrator rather than Watson, either he it sort of wouldn't make sense for him to explain his thinking, or if he did, he would come over as just intolerably arrogant. I mean, he is a very arrogant character, but it's kind of okay because of the way Watson is observing and describing it, rather than it coming out of Holmes's mouth direct. There's a couple of stories where Holmes does tell the story in the first person instead of Watson, and what's charming about those is that he attempts to kind of copy Watson's style, because he knows that now that's the accepted style for a Sherlock Holmes story, and that's what the readers will expect, the customers, as it were. So that's my 5 examples of the uses that Victorian writers of fiction make of first-person narrative. Have you got any books that you think fit into one of those 5 kind of categories? Or have you got another example of the kinds of ways that Victorian authors use first person? Because I'd love to hear them. And I hope that you've found a wonderful thing to read for Petra's Challenge.